My family do live in Islay. My parents and my sister still have self-catering hospitality interests there. Actually, thinking about it, you know, my credentials with this industry probably go back even further than that. I'm a farmer's son, and from the age of about 11, 12 onwards, every summer I would be evicted from my bedroom as my mother did visitors, as we used to say back in the day. And, you know, that sort of organic growth in the industry was very much a feature of life in the 1970s. And, you know, living in Orkney, an industry, sorry, a community where the visitor economy and tourism industry is central to the lives of so many people, you're never far away from it. Some of my closest friends and neighbours work in the industry in many different ways. And, you know, I just offer you this thought. We call it an industry, but there are so many different routes into it that, in fact, it's probably more of an ecosystem in a place like this than it is a single industry. So.
Thank you very much, Alistair. So you represent Orkney and Shetland. Shetland, sadly, I've never visited. Orkney, I know actually particularly well, and it's a very lovely part of the world. So you're a lucky man. Just in terms of general sort of context and questions, obviously we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic, which seems to be ongoing and running and running and running. Can you give any idea of the atmosphere at Westminster and the general outlook over and above what's reported about our Prime Minister at the moment?
Well, be careful about what you read about what's reported about any of us. I give you that one health warning right at the start. Look, I think, well, first of all, let me say I'm talking to you this morning from Orkney, and I haven't been in Westminster since the middle of December. Prior to that, I had spent most of the back end of the year in Westminster, but obviously still talking to my colleagues as we all do. I would say that, you know, some of the early certainties about how this was going to pan out, what the effects of it would be, have been replaced. Shall I say, I think people have been chastened a bit by being a bit overconfident in their predictions, and now we realise that actually what you have to do is just respond to the circumstances as they present themselves. Yes, have a strategy, have a direction of travel that you want to go in, but you realise that when something like the variant strain of COVID appears, that you have to be able to be flexible and to respond, and that you have to follow the best advice and evidence at that stage. This is an art, it's not a science. It's the art of politics. And I think that those who do best in an environment like this are those who are prepared to be, you know, pragmatic and not get too hung up on uncertainties. So it does diminish confidence, I think, in the effectiveness and the wisdom of government if you have a Prime Minister, for example, on Sunday who says, absolutely, we must keep every school open, this is the top priority, and then on Monday turns around and closes all the schools. So, you know, humility, I think, is the watchword. That not always something that comes easy to politicians, but I think we're getting there.
I mean, clearly, this is unprecedented in terms of an environment for all of us to be working in, and not least the political establishment. But in amongst the gloom, there is the bright light of the vaccine rollout, and it does appear that in the UK we have got slightly ahead of the curve on this. Scotland has been criticised for perhaps being slightly behind the curve. Have you got any observation about Scotland's performance in this regard, and how do you see the vaccine rollout happening north of the border?
Right. Well, as far as the performance in general is concerned, I think presentationally the Scottish Government have probably done a better job than their UK counterparts in Westminster and Whitehall. In terms of outcomes, I'm not sure that there's actually been that much difference. For reasons of pragmatism, they've really kept more or less in lockstep, but for reasons of politics, they've wanted to make it look rather different. I am a bit disappointed in their performance in terms of vaccine rollout. I think, you know, the excuses about care homes and the rest of it do look a bit more threadbare with every day that passes. But frankly, I think that is something that is just too important. So I think I would want to see everybody in the Scottish Parliament just focusing on identifying the problems there, removing the bureaucracy and getting the vaccines out to people. And it is always going to be more difficult in Scotland because we have big areas of land which are fairly sparse in their population terms, and that is going to produce different challenges. But you know, just focus on the job, and we'll deal with the excuses later, would be my gut instinct as far as the vaccine is concerned.
Okay, and looking forward a little bit, we've obviously got elections coming up in May, both in Scotland and around the country. Do you think, Alistair, those elections are likely to be postponed?
If I knew the answer to that, then speaking as the chair of the Liberal Democrat campaign in Scotland, I probably wouldn't have the hour to talk to you this morning. I'm presuming that they are going ahead. If America can hold presidential elections, and Georgia's just had a Senate runoff in January, then I think it would be difficult for us to say that no, we couldn't hold them. Having said that, you may have noticed that the government south of the border has said that it is now no longer permissible for political parties to be delivering leaflets. If that is going to remain the case, say, more than maybe 3 or 4 weeks' time, because we're on a sort of self-denying ordinance in Scotland at the moment, then you have to question whether they can be held fairly. They can be held safely, but can they be held fairly when Nicola Sturgeon, for example, is regularly on television sort of giving her address to the nation, whereas the rest of us are shut out of that. And if we are to be denied the opportunities to put our message across, then I think that would need to be revisited. But at the moment, I'm assuming that they're going ahead, and if circumstances dictate otherwise, then we'll deal with that when it happens.
In terms of the current lockdown, I mean, the hospitality sector has obviously been battered over the last 12, 15 months, more than probably any other sector. And I think if you look, in reality, hospitality businesses in Scotland have been able to trade for about 3 months in the last 18 months. If you take into account, the sort of closed season and all the rest of it, which is clearly devastating for pretty much any business. And now the big question on everybody's minds is, when is the lockdown going to lift? And I think, people were optimistic that maybe it was going to be mid-February, or then maybe it was going to be the beginning of March. What's the mood music you're getting from Westminster, Alistair? Do you have any sense of what the government is thinking at the moment in this regard?
Very little that is reliable beyond what you would read in the newspapers and see on the television yourself, to be quite candid about that. And I mean, it's self-evident that an industry like yours that relies on people socialising is going to be the worst hit by lockdown. If the current vaccine rollout continues and is successful, and if we're not blown off course again by something that we're not able to predict at the moment, like another strain or something of that sort, then the sense I get from government ministers and officials is that we would be looking towards some sort of freeing up of regulation by round about mid-March. Now, I think you were telling me earlier already that Gleneagles are looking at opening again mid-March. At the moment, that looks like a decent guess, but it's a decent guess that's just shy of 2 months away. And if you ask yourself today, what did your business and your life look 2 months ago, and how much of it would you have predicted then? You can see perhaps the danger of trying to predict even 2 months ahead in a pandemic.
Yeah, no, I understood. But that is helpful. Is that Gleneagles have put down a marker of the 15th of March, but we shall see. But one of the frustrations, I think, of the hospitality industry is the very short notice that they've been receiving to open and close and open and close. And again, we kind of understand that we are in extremely difficult times and governments need to make decisions quickly, but it is very frustrating, and the more lead time one can get, the better. Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly the government south of the border in Westminster and indeed in Scotland have done a great deal to support the industry with obviously the furlough scheme, VAT relief, mm-hmm. business rates relief, and so forth. But as this continues and the crisis sort of rolls on, have you any hope that you can hold out to people there may be further relief on the way?
I think there will have to be. I mean, I think you see the way the furlough scheme has now been rolled through to the end of April shows that there's an understanding in government that, that's the earliest point that we will be looking at any sort of easing of things. I think as an industry, if I were in your position, I would be looking at it from 2 points of view. First of all, there is the immediate, the here and now. I think that, if you think about the business interruption scheme loans, for example, they were devised at a time when we were expecting really to be clear of this by now. So the repayment schedules for that, I think, is going to have to be revisited. I think, candidly, Treasury probably made some fairly cynical calculations about the ability of people who are self-employed, company directors being paid in dividends and the rest of it, just to take a bigger hit than the rest of us. And I think that that's going to have to be addressed. You can't leave the number of people excluded that we have done. So, that's where I would expect to be focusing my attention for the next 2 or 3 months. But really what we need to be doing now is a bit of looking forward to say, what are going to be the challenges and indeed the opportunities for the industry when we are eventually back in the sunny uplands. I think if you look at it from an Orkney perspective, I think that, as always, confidence will be a lagging indicator. So I think that we probably will be unlikely to see a return to full cruise ship business this year, because I just honestly don't see that people will have the confidence to go back into that sort of holiday for a while yet. But I think on the upside, I think there probably will be more of a homegrown market. So, how can we get our own share of that? I think, 18 months, which is, probably what you're going to have by the time you start to emerge from this, or maybe even longer, is a long time for a hospitality business to be at best ticking over, or, realistically, for most of them in hibernation and dormant. So I think getting some of the basics back, and that might be things like marketing or whatever, but even more basic than that, I think there's going to be a big training need for the industry. First of all, because quite a lot of people who have previously been making a living of whatever sort from the industry will have found other things to do with their time in the meantime. And secondly, just because the labour market is going to be very, very different in the future. So, you know, when I'm banging in the door of ministers in London and Edinburgh, that's the sort of issue that I think I will want to be getting fairly urgent attention on now, so that when we get to that point, maybe it's going to be April, May, June, that we've actually got some thinking done and got something in place. You know, I don't often quote Ronald Reagan with approval, but he had a fantastic line in the 1980s, which is something that has always stuck with me. And he said, the scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And, you know, I think that as an industry, you should be doing a bit of the thinking now and informing government thinking on what's going to come in the future. Because if you rely on the government to, you know, produce a package for you, they will produce a package that suits the government rather than one that works for the industry. That's just how life, government and politics works. I also think that we need a pretty urgent review now, and this takes me back maybe to the point about the May elections, about how we deliver economic development in communities. You know, I am old enough to remember the days of the Highlands and Islands Development Board. Now, I'm not saying go back to the HIDB, but there were elements of the work that the HIDB did, which was rooted in communities and which was sensitive to community needs and community wishes, which has been lost from the Highlands and Islands Enterprise Network. You know, when John Swinney took his axe to Highlands and Islands Enterprise in 2007, I think we all knew that the organisation did need a significant amount of reform, but for the many problems of that network, I think one of the great advantages was that you had people who were business people on the boards of the local enterprise companies, and they brought a tremendous amount of skill and judgment to the decisions in economic development, and that's been lost. So something that prizes control of economic development out of the fingers of the ministers and the civil servants in Edinburgh would be my first priority for that. I know that there's the seat at the table campaign for a tourism or a visitor economy, hospitality sector minister, and that would have significant advantages, but that alone, I think, is not going to be enough. I think you have to have the mechanisms for delivery of that much more closely rooted in the communities across the Highlands and Islands. And what's true of the Highlands and Islands is also true of the borders, and incidentally, what already is some of what's happening in the northeast of Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, I know you've been quite vocal about your views about Highlands and Islands Enterprise and how it perhaps
only the more
needs
moderate ones of my views. I could be much more vocal if we wanted.
I mean, for me, I mean, I've had dealings recently with HIE, and I mean, one of their big challenges at the moment is they have absolutely no idea what level of funding they're going to have moving forward, which seems pretty crazy when they're fast approaching the end of their financial year. I don't know if that's something which you're lobbying Holyrood on to get more money into the hands, because clearly an organisation such as HIE, whilst it may be imperfect, at least is reasonably well positioned to be investing in or supporting economic development, particularly in more far-flung rural locations where communities are so fragile. I mean, is that something that's on your agenda?
Yeah, although I mean, I do honestly feel now that budget is only part of the problem. I mean, you're right, we're sitting almost at the end of January, and the idea that they're not going to know what their budget's going to be for the beginning of April, I think is you know, nonsensical. You have to hope that they're getting better indications of that from the ministers and in government. But I do think, though, that the tasks that they are asked to perform by government are far too limited in their range. You know, as well as the strategic, you have to have somebody who's able to deliver the tactics. Now, there might be a role for local government in that. There might be economic development. Whatever it is, it has to have that input from businesses. So, you know, if you go back to the days of Orkney Enterprise and Shetland Enterprise, the people who were on the board there were people who had a good understanding of the industries, the sectors that were important to us. And that will be very different from the industries and the sectors that will be important in Inverness, for example. You know, I don't doubt, for example, that life sciences are a very important part of the economic picture in Inverness, but frankly, they're not of the same importance in Orkney, and they're not going to be the same importance for Oban or Fort William or Islay or Mull or wherever else it's going to be. So it's having the people who understand the realities of life at the sharp end and who are prepared to speak truth unto power. Because, you know, if you leave everything like that to civil servants, then they're going to be telling ministers that everything's fine, there's not a problem. I've seen this since the 1st of January, because I've spent most of the last 3 weeks dealing with fish traders trying to export fish from Shetland to the continent. And, you know, I see sitting in the middle of all this, the reality of what is hitting the businesses in Shetland. And I also see in London ministers who are, gently shall I say it, a bit on the complacent side, and they are complacent because their officials are telling them that, don't worry, Minister, it's all fine, it's just a blip, we'll have this sorted out in a few days' time. If they actually were exposed real time, as I am, to the people who are drowning in the bureaucracy of a fairly straightforward business like exporting fish now, or ought to be straightforward, then they might see things differently.
Thank you, Alistair. I did say to your secretary, Richard Wood, that I wasn't going to get political, but a question has popped into the chat box, and I wouldn't be let off the hook if I didn't ask it.
That's not your fault, then.
What do you sense is maybe the fallout of the Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond ongoing saga?
Well, now, there's a question. I honestly don't know where that one is going to end up. I would just offer you this one thought, that the way that inquiry is constituted, and the way in which government has been able to hinder the conduct of that inquiry and the difficulties that have been encountered, it does indicate that politics in Scotland has some fairly serious structural issues to address at the moment. Those of you who read Brian Wilson in the Scotsman will have seen his commentary on this in recent weeks, and he puts it more eloquently than I could. But I can't imagine questions of that sort being kicked down the road in Westminster in the way in which they have been in Edinburgh. So where does it all take us? I don't know. We have to wait and see. There are significant problems for Nicola Sturgeon. She's got big questions that she will have to answer. If you saw her on Mar at the weekend, you'll see that she didn't look particularly comfortable in refusing to answer them. But that's going to catch up with them eventually. And if you live by the high-minded press release, then you will eventually die by the high-minded press release if you don't meet the standards that you demand of others.
Thank you. So, just to revert to the topic that you touched on a little while ago, which is the a seat at the table campaign to lobby for a Minister of Hospitality. Is that a campaign that you have been supporting, that you are able to support? Because clearly for those on this call, it's a pretty fundamental on their wish list.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think because of the nature of the hospitality industry, the diversity of operations that you have, and the way in which it cuts across just about every sector in government, somebody in Edinburgh and somebody in Whitehall who has that specific job of pulling all these threads together has you know, that's got real attraction for me. I would be cautious though about putting all my eggs in that one basket. If you do have a Minister for Hospitality, then it has to be more than just that coordinating role. I think that he or she has got to have executive responsibility for delivering it. And it can't be a case that, you know, they just turn up at industry events and nod and smile sympathetically and say, oh, well, that's very interesting, I'll go and tell Treasury about it. You know, they've got to be the people to make the decisions. And I think that the, you know, I come back to my point about Highlands and Islands Enterprise and you know, a need for a different focus there. The actual delivery is going to be crucial, you know, and that needs to be decentralized. And, you know, having one more politician involved in the industry is potentially a mixed blessing. Having more industry people involved in having a say in the industry, I think, would be my top priority. Because, you know, what was it Robin Day said about John Knott, you know, a here today, gone tomorrow politician. I think that's true of us all, unfortunately, but it's words that carry a certain resonance several decades later. Thank
you, Alistair. Just to sort of draw things to a close, hold on. Let's just get rid of that.
That's a fantastic ringtone you've got there, Roddy.
Yeah. So yeah, just to bring things to a close. You know, looking at your crystal ball, and we've all got one, and some people's crystal balls are a bit better than others. What is your sort of outlook as it would impact on the hospitality sector for sort of 2021?
I mean, okay, I'll remind you of all the caveats that I gave you earlier on about the danger of predictions, and rather than give you a straight answer to where I think things are going to be, let me give you a thought that actually nothing is inevitable. And that if we approach this in the right way, then yeah, there are going to be significant difficulties for us all. You know, I don't think the real impact of this pandemic has yet hit our economy. I think that will come when we start to remove government support, and it's not just for your sector, it will be right across. You know, my wife runs a local veterinary practice here in Orkney. They've never been busier because people are spending more time at home with their pets, and their income hasn't really been impacted by the pandemic in a way that it might have been. And because they're staying home, they've got more disposable income to spend on things like pets. So, you know, for her, she has to say, well, is this something which is going to carry on in the future, in which case we'll take on another vet nurse, another receptionist, another vet, or am I going to take on these staff now and find that I'm then stranded in 6 months' time. So, you know, these are the decisions that people are going to be making across the economy. And if we do the right things, if we listen to the right people, and if we don't just allow, dare I say it, the accountants and the economists to make all the decisions, then I think we can come back stronger from this. I think it will take some fairly bold decision making. I think it will require ministers in whichever government they are part to take decisions that will be risky. As a country, we will perhaps need to be a bit more understanding of politicians who take difficult decisions and make risky decisions for, you know, good reasons, and accepting that when you take a risk, sometimes it will not end well. If we carry on doing as we have been doing, which is just basically, you know, returning to a model that had problems without trying to fix it, then we will continue to have problems. I think the short answer to your question, Rory, is it's really up to ourselves how we come out of this. You know, nothing is inevitable. There will be opportunities as well as difficulties. And if we seize these opportunities and make the most of them, then, you know, investing in the necessary modernization of our infrastructure, I'm thinking things like broadband and new technologies, investing in the training of people to take the jobs that are going to be there is going to be absolutely critical. Retraining people in sectors like yourselves for people who have been laid off and people who will be new entrants to the industry. These are the things that we should be investing in. And, you know, maybe not just where we'll be this year. I think you need a government that, when you have some certainty in planning, has a clear idea of where it's going to be in 5 and 10 years' time, and the strategy to get you there.
So thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your candor. And most of all, thank you for your time today, for joining us. It's very much appreciated, and very interesting observations, which we will take away. So thank you. I hope you might be tempted to come and join us again at some point in the future. Absolutely. To give us a bit of an update, perhaps in sunnier times. But no, your time is hugely appreciated. So well, thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the questions, and thank you to whoever it was that muted, because you're not the only one with a Labrador in the background, and it could have become
Italian dogs.
Okay, thank you. Now.
Thank you. Very interesting.
All right.
Thanks very much, Alistair. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So now it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Paul Charles. Paul is well known to many of you on the call. He's been a regular correspondent and contributor. As I mentioned at the outset, Paul is founder of the PC Agency, which represents the interests of businesses in the hospitality, travel and tourism sector around the world. He has a very global perspective. Paul, we've got quite a lot of people from across Europe with us today. So we've got quite an international flavor to our meeting today. Paul has, amongst other things, been leading a campaign called Quarantine, and has been lobbying the government on behalf of the travel sector to try and get travel loosened up. But let me hand you the baton, Paul, and perhaps you can give us an update. Obviously, there have been some announcements in the last 24 hours or so, but perhaps you can also give a bit of a perspective for some of our European colleagues who are no doubt sitting there wondering what's going on as well. So welcome back. Thank you very much for your time again, Paul.
Thank you,
The floor
Roddy.
is yours.
Thank you very much. Always pleasure to take time out to do these sessions, because it's so important to get views from across the UK. So let me bring you up to date on what is happening today, first of all. There have been lots of leaks in the UK media about the government's next tightening of border measures. There will be an announcement at 5 o'clock today by Boris Johnson, who will be leading today's press conference. The meeting of senior cabinet ministers is at 1:30 today. It's a group called COVID-O, the most senior cabinet ministers, who meet to decide big strategic decisions on COVID. And it's difficult to read exactly how they're going to go, but as a minimum, we understand, or I understand from talking to cabinet sources, that they will be introducing quarantine in a hotel for 10 days, paid for by the passenger. And that will be introduced within the next 3 weeks, possibly sooner, but certainly during February. And that will be for high risk travelers coming in, or high risk countries coming into the UK. So any airport, any ferry terminal, Eurostar, if you've come from a high risk country, you will have to quarantine in a hotel, and you will be taken to that hotel by a government coach or bus of some kind. The indications are those high risk countries at the moment are the whole of South America, Southern Africa, so including South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique and others, and also Portugal. And Portugal, because of course the close connections with Brazil specifically, where there is concern about the Amazon. I love the dogs in Italy, by the way. So there is concern, of course, that this measure will actually be wider. And the reason why that concern is growing is because quite a lot of ministers have gone to ground this morning who would normally be briefing informally. And the suggestion is, in fact, the Prime Minister may well decide that everybody will have to quarantine in a hotel coming into the UK, which is the worst scenario possible, in my opinion. So we'll know at 5 o'clock. We will get an indication probably just before that of which way it's heading. But certainly as a minimum, the starting point is travellers from high-risk countries. And the government will certainly, if it doesn't go down the route of everyone coming into the UK having to quarantine in a hotel, it will say they reserve the right to do that within days or weeks. So the issue fundamentally is, first of all, people coming into the country from high-risk areas would have to pay maybe £100 a night for a hotel room for 10 days, plus tests bookended at either end of the stay. So certainly 2 tests, maybe 3 tests. That will, of course, put off many people from coming into the UK from who are visiting. There are only about 12 to 15,000 people coming into the UK at the moment as a whole. So around about 70, 80,000 people a week maximum coming into the UK at the moment. And that's across the country. And the big question is, of course, once these measures are in place, it's going to take time to get them released. We know that governments like putting measures in place to be seen to be tough. There seem to be popular measures in opinion polls. The problem, as we know, is governments don't like removing these measures very quickly. And so my concern, and in fact the fear of talking to quite a few airlines and tour operators in the last 24 hours, is that these measures will stay in place for some time. And if they are widespread enough that everybody has to quarantine coming in a hotel, then if you're looking at a year, this is one of the worst things to face the sector. So that's where we're at.
So not terribly encouraging news. So one assumes from the point of view of people looking to book an overseas holiday, that's pretty much nailed it, because they're not going to want to quarantine when they come back in again.
Yeah, it's very good news for staycations, I think. And I'm aware from some of my clients that staycation bookings have been certainly increasing in the last 2 weekends, as the confidence remains that people will be able to move around the UK this summer, maybe from Easter onwards as well. But the most popular booking periods at the moment are July and August, followed by Easter weeks. So it's good news, of course, for many people on this call who rely on UK domestic business, and we should be thankful for that. It does suggest that there will be a strong summer, assuming the vaccination program works and continues as planned. It's bad news if you rely on overseas visitors to fill your occupancy and you can't fill the gap with UK domestic. It's bad news for airlines, who of course rely on so much overseas traffic coming in, especially business traffic in the premium cabins. And it's bad news, I think, for the sector, because naturally it will shrink, simply because if there's no end date, and I can't believe the Prime Minister will give an end date, I don't think he knows, but if there's no end date, why would anyone book an overseas holiday knowing that you could have to quarantine and pay for it for 10 days in a hotel when you come back? You wouldn't book it. So that will start to hurt the tour operators and villa specialists, etc., car hire firms from today, as soon as that announcement is made at 5 o'clock.
And one assumes, and I'm thinking about some of our friends on the call today from Europe, that it's pretty bad news for any European destinations which rely heavily on the UK leisure market.
Yeah, I've been very clear up until the last 24 hours that I really did think that the 1st of May onwards would be pretty well open for UK or most UK travellers to be able to go overseas, certainly short haul, and book to stay overseas, because of course the vaccination programme by the 1st of May should have hit 35 million people, maybe 40 million people in the UK. The vast majority of people, certainly those at risk, will have been vaccinated. So therefore, the restrictions will start to be released by that time, and the pressure on the fantastic NHS will be much less by that time. So you can imagine a scenario come May where we would normally be able to travel across the UK and visit overseas, certainly short haul. Long haul is going to take much longer. But of course, what the government is now doing is, and the narrative has changed in Westminster in the last 48 hours. What the government is now saying is that in order to stop any future strains coming in, and in order to protect the vaccination program's success, why would the borders be left open for people to threaten what we've achieved in this country? Now, it's a difficult argument to argue against, I have to say, because of course it makes sense to protect the vaccine investment and rollout. But if you take that argument at face value, it does mean, when on earth would they open up the borders again? Because there are going to be strains of coronavirus emerging over the next year anyway. The flu changes every year, so COVID will change every year. And I think they seem to be adopting the Australia model. And the Australia model has been lock those borders, do hotel quarantine, and it's been in place nearly a year, and it's due to be in place until early 2022 at this rate. So the fear is that the government is pursuing a strongly domestic policy, protect the UK, build the UK economy, and prevent strains coming into the UK. And
as a matter of interest, Paul, do you have any perspective, well, I'm sure you do, a perspective of Europe, the wider globe, in terms of how other countries are reacting at the moment and are behaving and are likely to behave? I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds almost like the sort of restrictions on international travel are going to, over the course of 2021, are going to become more extreme, and that, I mean, which must have catastrophic implications for airlines and so forth, and companies which rely on international travel. I mean, it sounds pretty gloomy.
I'm afraid it is. I think the narrative, as I say, has changed globally in the last few days. I was on a call with Finland, the team in Tourism Finland, Visit Finland this morning, and even Finland is now introducing tougher measures and not expecting anything to open up before, certainly before Easter at this stage. Israel closed its international borders at the weekend. So, and I honestly think Israel is the model the government is following. The UK government is following at the moment in terms of its vaccine rollout and how it deals with it. They're ahead of the game. They've vaccinated, I think, 40% of the population. They're aiming to vaccinate 80% of the population before they open their borders. So the UK government are watching Israel closely. And the fact that Israel have closed their borders to prevent future strains coming in, I think is a sign of what will happen here. Yes, you are seeing other countries tighten up. And I think governments are adopting the mantra of some extent of jingoism and protecting their borders and protecting their own. And I see it actually as the unraveling of globalization, I'm afraid. I think we are entering an era, certainly a vaccine era for the next 2 to 3 years, of being more domestic and growing our own domestic trade, producing our own, and that has its benefits, of course it does. But to all of us who work in travel and hospitality, the very thought of unraveling globalization, preventing people crossing borders is horrific. And I'm advising clients at the moment that you've got to reinvent yourself. I'm afraid this is reality now. I think you've got to prepare your promotional programs for mostly domestic. That means packages and incentives to promote domestic travel. It means less reliance on overseas markets, if at all, and less reliance on working with airlines because most of your customer base is going to be domestic. And I think the other big thing is that consumers are changing their habits rapidly. We know that large companies, especially, and certainly small ones, are reducing their office space. So we're going to be living in a world where many employees will only have to work in an office maybe 2 days a week, maybe 3 at the most. And in that case, it means there'll be more opportunity for hoteliers, especially, to attract people midweek who don't need to go into an office and to mix their stay as a work stay as well as a leisure stay. So I think hoteliers will need to open specific work areas potentially where I could stay for a week or 2 and have 50% working time and 50% leisure time during my stay. So that means a huge change in terms of what hotels of the future are going to look like. And I think we're going to be in this world certainly for 2 or 3 years. I don't see it changing.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, I'm just going to ask Mark Crothall to, he's just dropped a note into the chat box to say that he's been on the phone with his Australian counterparts this morning. It'd be interesting just to get his views, and has also been talking to his oppo in Iceland. Mark's the Chief Executive of the Scottish Tourism Alliance. Mark, welcome. I can't actually see you on the screen, but I'm sure you're there somewhere.
I've got a nice backdrop of Eden Castle, Roddy, so I'm sure you find me somewhere. But yeah, good morning, everyone. And Paul, thanks for that. Yeah, Margie Osmond, who is the CEO of the Tourism Transport Forum, we have a regular catch-up, share the pain. So I had a 6 a.m. Zoom with her this morning. She was in 38 degrees, I was in -5. She was drinking champagne, I was drinking coffee. Yeah, 909 deaths in Australia. That's the situation out there at the moment. 30,000 people a day voluntarily being tested in Sydney. It's a way of life, but they are quarantined, as Paul was saying at the outset, and she doesn't see any sort of indication of international movement until Q2, Q3 22. So they're very much sticking to the lockdown, but what it has, as you said, it's decimated, major parts of the country where, international tourism in the resort areas are dependent on that market. So heavy fallout of job loss. But the government, and they've just been through various elections, of course, are all playing the card, let's protect the country. At the earliest, she thought if they do open up anything, it might be into Japan and obviously across the way. But quarantine, $3,000, 14 days. minimum. That's what's expected to be paid, and that's just the way that's the way it is, and they've not moved from it. So watching across from here, of course, seeing and feeling sorry for us, understandably, but their concern is propping up the airline industry, and how do you actually make sure that those routes are still protected for the future, and obviously when can it get going again. But looking at different ways of doing tourism, again, the sustainable agenda, and actually getting the domestic movement much more supportive in innovating product in a different way. So quite sobering, to say the least. I did a talk with her back in May last year. They'd had 92 deaths. So, okay, a lot of them came very quickly in Victoria, I think a few months back, but given that they've contained it to just 900 is quite amazing. My opposite number in Iceland, Johannes, we caught up last Friday, and you've probably seen that Iceland put a marker in the ground for the 1st of May that they'll open up international travel, but very much with a sort of traffic light system around a great set of criteria that you have to follow. But they've shown intent that I suppose that they are open and they need people back. But obviously there's measures there which may inhibit or otherwise. But this unknown quantity, and I think Paul's actually hit it on the nail on the head, is when. And I think any business owner would want to have a date. Give us assurance, even for the domestic movement. Because at the moment we don't even know that. May 1 was a sign, I suppose, a few weeks back of being a possible reopen. We've seen UK government yesterday give extended powers to local authorities to say potentially you can keep the hospitality sector closed until July the 17th, which is, again, a sign that's worrying. And then I suppose it does beg the question of whether or not there will be a divide, and Scottish government say, I'm sorry, nobody can come over the border from England either. So, we'll have to see how that one plays out, which would severely impact our domestic movement. If we're losing the international stuff, the loss of any southern-based market as well would be horrendous. And so the focus, obviously, from our side remains firmly on how do you secure and protect the support for the industry as a whole, but also make sure that we can maintain a level of support for the inbound operator, the MCs, so that those relationships can be maintained and the routes can be secured. And that's a long haul, and the government have to recognise that that's a key priority for them to do. So lots on the table and lots of interest, as you would expect, by various television companies who are pouring over us at the moment, and I'll have to dip off and do the first STV interview in a minute. So but worrying times, and it's a moving feast, as we all know.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and as insightful and helpful as ever. I have to say, pretty gloomy roundup one way and another today. To some of our European friends who are with us today, it'd be really nice to get some of your views from across Europe. And I think what I might do is set up a session in 2 or 3 weeks to actually get you to tell us a little bit about what's happening in your own home countries, if nothing else, to give us a little bit of comfort that we're not in this alone. But thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, particularly Paul. Always a great pleasure to have you on the call. And
Roddy, can I just answer one question on the chat?
Yeah, please.
If you don't mind, that seems to be
no, please do.
A really important question. I think it's from Panos, actually. Do you foresee that UK travellers will not be allowed to travel outbound for Easter? Well, it's a bit of a $64 million question, but my feeling is by Easter, certainly England will be in the tier restrictions again. We will have come out of, all being well, we will have come out of lockdown, national lockdown, and we'll be back to the tier restrictions, which Boris Johnson believes do work. So it will depend on which tier you're in as to whether you can travel. And frankly, up to tier 3, you are really allowed to travel. It's not illegal at this stage. So I would hope that large parts of England are down to tier 3. My fear is that the government may try and keep a lot of England in tier 4 to keep the numbers down, infection numbers down. But there will be some travel. The problem is that airlines are going to give up at some stage on planning the routes. The airline planners I know very well are already pulling their hair out, unable to plan for the future. So the danger is the flights won't be available at short notice if the government makes a decision in March as to what to do at Easter. And they're not going to land themselves in the same position as they did at Christmas, where they opened up too much. So I think there is a nervousness in Downing Street about opening for Easter too much, but it's likely will be in the tier restrictions, which should mean some people can travel. But I wouldn't be booking an overseas holiday from the UK for Easter. I'd be booking for May onwards.
Thank you, Paul. Highly appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you for the question, Panos. Always a pleasure to see you online. So thank you very much again, Paul. Thank you, Mark, and thank you in absentia to Alistair Carmichael for his update. Next week, we have our friend Chris Tarrant coming back to give us an update on consumer sentiment in the UK, particularly as it relates to the hospitality industry. And we'll also be welcoming back STR Global, who will be giving us an update on the global performance of the hotel sector. So an interesting sort of review of what's going on in the wider market. Thank you all for joining us today. Great pleasure to see you all. Particular pleasure to welcome our friends from Europe. I hope you'll come back and join us on a regular basis. Panos has been a very regular attender, and always nice to see your face, and nice to know that despite Brexit, we may at least be getting closer to our European cousins rather than further away from them. And as Michael Gregg very aptly put it the other day. So thank you all very much indeed. Look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next Tuesday morning at the same time. And as per usual, there'll be a follow-up, and I'll send out a copy of the recording, which you're welcome to pass on to anybody else that you think might like to see it. And if you've got any friends, colleagues that you think would enjoy being part of this group, then simply let me know, and we'll be very happy to add them to the invitation list. Thank you again all, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. And in the meantime, stay safe and keep fighting the good fight. All the very best.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Roddy. Bye.
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 Lovely to see you all.
Thank you, Roddy.
Great
Cheers,
pleasure.
Roddy.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Roddy. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much,
Great
everyone.
pleasure.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Roddy.